If you've ever looked up football fail compilations on YouTube, you may have seen this clip. Some people may think it's just a silly own goal that happened sometime in the 90s. Others, more aware, will recognize the clip as the own goal that led to the death of the player responsible for it. This man's name was Andrés Escobar, and while most people seem to be interested on his death and what led up to it, making my research, I became interested on Escobar's life. So this will be my best attempt to honor his memory by telling his full story, and also the history of the teams he represented. Andrés Escobar Saldarriaga was born on the 13th of March of 1967 in the Colombian city of Medellin. He grew up in a middle-class family, and since he was little, he knew he wanted to play football. His older brother Santiago was a footballer too, and played for the team the family supported, Atlético Nacional. He played for different teams while attending school, the Institute Conrado Gómez, starting as a defensive midfielder but slowly transitioning to a centre-back, helped by his height, and then got to join the club he loved most, Atlético Nacional, making his debut in 1987, a few days after his 20th birthday. During a time where being a defender was associated with being tough and violent, Escobar shined with his technique on the ball. His playing technique matched his personality, as he always tried to play from the back, and his challenges were clean, committing few fouls and rarely getting booked or doing something unsportsmanlike, earning him the nickname the Gentleman of Football. His performances with Atlético Nacional earned him a call-up for the Colombian national team in 1988, making his debut against Canada on March 30th, and a few days later, he would score the equalizer in a friendly against England in Wembley, which would be his only international goal. Well, kind of, but we'll get there later. After coming in a frustrating second place in the 1988 Colombian Championship, Atlético Nacional qualified for the 1989 Copa Libertadores. After a sloppy start to their campaign with 3 consecutive draws and a loss to Colombian rivals Millonarios, Nacional would win their 2 remaining games, one of them thanks to a goal from Escobar, to progress out of the group stage in second place. And they would ride on that momentum, knocking out Racing Club from Argentina in the round of 16, Millonarios in the quarterfinals. They destroyed Danubio from Uruguay in the semis, and suddenly it was them and Olimpia from Paraguay in the Copa Libertadores final. After losing 2-0 in Asunción, Nacional would recover from the deficit in Medellin to force a penalty shootout. Escobar scored the first penalty, but the rest of the shootout would be chaotic. After the first 10 penalties, the score was 4-4, and so the teams went into sudden death. And then, miss after miss, after miss, after miss, after miss. No team was able to win it, until Leonel Alvarez finally scored and Andrés Escobar had cemented himself as a club legend, winning the first Copa Libertadores not only for Nacional, but for Colombia as a whole. The entire country, even rival fans, celebrated Nacional's continental win, which also qualified them for the 1989 Intercontinental Cup, the predecessor to the Club World Cup, where Nacional would play against the AC Milan of Arrigo Sacchi. The names of the opposition were the stuff of legends: Costa Curta, Baresi, Maldini, Ricciard, Ancelotti, Donadoni, Van Basten, and yet Nacional held strong. But despite their valiant effort, a single goal from Alberico Evani would see Nacional miss on the chance of being world champions. But they were still recognized not only in Colombia, but in Europe as well, and many scouters began looking at the young talent in the Colombian team. Around this time, Escobar also played the World Cup qualifiers with Colombia, after topping a group including Paraguay and Ecuador, and beating Israel in the Intercontinental playoffs. Andrés helped Colombia qualify for their first World Cup in 28 years. You see, the successes of Nacional and Colombia around this time were no coincidence. Los Cafeteros were blessed with a golden generation. Apart from Escobar, Colombia also had the likes of Faustino Asprilla, René Higuita, Leonel Álvarez, Freddy Rincón, and Carlos Valderrama, managed by the coach of Atlético Nacional, Pacho Maturana. and those men would be the ones to represent Colombia at Italia 90. In the first game, they beat the United Arab Emirates 2-0 in what was Colombia's first ever win at a World Cup. Los Cafeteros would lose their next game 1-0 to Yugoslavia, meaning they'd have to get a result against current World Cup silver medal holders, West Germany. Colombia put up a great effort, but in the 88th minute Pierre Litvarsky gave Germany the lead, and it seemed like Colombia's adventure in Italy would be short-lived. But in an amazing play, in the last ball of the game, Valderrama would find Freddy Rincon through on goal to score the most celebrated goal in Colombian history, as the surprising result was enough to see them advance to the round of 16, where they would face the other underdog of this World Cup, Cameroon. The game was very back and forth and Colombia had some clear chances, but with the score staying 0-0 after 90 minutes, the game would go to extra time. And it would be in the second half of extra time that legendary striker Roger Milla would find a breakthrough. And to make matters worse for Colombia, only 3 minutes later, René Higuita would give the ball away for Milla to get a second. And despite Colombia getting one back, they still got eliminated. But even then, they were praised back home for how they represented the country. With his performances for both Colombia and Atlético Nacional, Escobar earned himself a loan move to Swiss club Young Boys. However, he never seemed to find his footing there, and despite leaving a good impression while he stayed, after 6 months and 8 games he was back in Medellin playing for Nacional, and on his first year back, he helped Nacional win the Colombian championship, and another second place finish in 1992. However, in March 1993, Escobar would suffer a heavy injury on his knee. He had two options: undergo surgery and miss the upcoming World Cup, or recover naturally, making the World Cup under the risk of getting injured again and probably not being able to play ever again. For Andrés, it was clear he was not gonna miss this World Cup, and so he trained on his own and recovered, watching from the sidelines as Colombia qualified emphatically to USA 94, going unbeaten and beating Argentina in Buenos Aires 5-0 in their last game. This made many people believe that Colombia could be a dark horse for the competition, with Pelé stating that Colombia would make at least the quarterfinals, and Colombians having even greater expectations. Escobar got to play the first games of the Colombian Championship in 1994, being in great form and leaving Nacional on first place before departing for the World Cup. However, things would not go as planned. In the first game, Colombia would play a team undergoing their own golden generation, Romania, and an inspired George Hagi and Florin Radichuyu would be enough to upset Colombia 3-1. The public back home in Colombia were shocked, and most certainly, people who had bet on Colombia to do well had lost big money, especially the cartels running the country. It's no secret that the situation in Colombia was very heated during the late 80s and early 90s. Pablo Escobar, who I think it's important to highlight that despite sharing last names and being from the same city has no relation with Andrés, had brought a reign of terror to Colombian people. Everyone thought that after he was killed by police in 1993 that better times were to come, but that couldn't have been further from the truth, as now that the boss was gone, everyone wanted to overtake the empire, and smaller, more violent cartels began rising up and committing atrocities across the country. Under these circumstances is that the people found hope in the national team, and now they had a life or death game ahead of them against the United States. And when I say life or death, I mean that in the most cruel and literal way. As after their defeat against Romania, the TVs of the Colombian concentration were hacked, and instead of displaying welcoming messages to the staff and players, they were now showing death threats to them and their families back home. Coach Maturana was called to his personal phone in his room, where someone told him to start midfielder Hernan Gaviria next game instead of Barrabás Gómez, or else he would be shot dead. This was clearly a threat from a cartel owner of Atlético Nacional, wanting to promote their players on the biggest stage while they could. And that's how we arrived to June 22nd, 1994. The dressing room of the Colombian national team is in sepulchral silence. Every player and staff has been threatened. Coach Maturana gave the pre-game talk with tears in his eyes, and it was under these less than ideal mental conditions that they had to tackle a must-win game against the host, United States. Los Cafeteros were still expected to win, and during the first minutes they dominated possession and had the better chances, but in the 34th minute, John Harkes put a cross inside the box. Escobar knew that he couldn't let the ball run past him or someone would score, but his interception was poorly timed, and it caught goalkeeper Oscar Cordova off guard as the ball rolled into his own net. Devastated, Andres laid on the pitch with his hands on his face, knowing just how big of a mistake he had just made. Colombia would concede another goal in the second half, and Valencia would get a late consolation goal, but it was all for nothing. This was the United States' first ever win at a World Cup since their historic win over England in 1950, and the qualification of the team to the round of 16 helped the growth and development of the sport in America. But for Colombia, Escobar's own goal had costed them badly, as now only a miracle would see them advancing to the next round. And despite beating Switzerland 2-0 in the final match day, Romania's win over USA saw Colombia eliminated in the group stage, in an extremely disappointing performance. After the threats, most players didn't return to Colombia right away. Most players were not Andres Escobar, who wanted to be with his family during this difficult time. Besides, he was never one to hide from his own people, but Andres really wasn't coping well with his mistake. It was all he could think about. He truly believed that this Colombian team had something special, and had they qualified to the next round, things could have been different. To help himself heal, he would write. He wrote about what he felt went wrong at the World Cup and how he felt on a personal level, and always trying to convey a message about moving forward and learning from this, ending his long letter with, "See you soon, because life doesn't end here." And he had every reason to believe that was true. After all, Andres was only 27. He was about to sign with Champions League winners AC Milan. Escobar was meant to be the successor of a certain Franco Baresi, and he was also recently engaged and was set to marry his girlfriend in 5 months. All of that would come to a sudden end on the early hours of July the 2nd. Escobar agreed to go with 2 friends to get dinner and a few drinks together to a bar known as El Indio in the neighborhood of El Poblado. Around 2 a.m., while Andres and his friends were chatting at their own table, 2 men began shouting things like "Mr. Own Goal" to Escobar, who approached the table where they were sitting and asked them to be respectful. After that, he decided to leave and went outside to the parking lot, going inside his blue Honda Civic. However, the 2 men, brothers Pedro and Juan Gallón Henao, who used to be part of Pablo Escobar's Medellin drug cartel and had continued their own businesses after his death, followed him outside. According to witnesses, Pedro began shouting at Andres, while the footballer asked to be left alone. This is when Juan approached too and said, "You don't know who you are messing with." And while he was saying that, the brother's driver, Humberto Muñoz Castro, got out of the white Toyota pickup truck with a gun and fired 6 shots at Escobar from point-blank range. Andres was mourned across the country. His murder, which was sadly one of many taking place in Colombia on a daily basis, was a national tragedy, and over 100,000 people attended his funeral. The investigation suggested that Juan Gallón had lost big money on betting after the game. However, the Gallón brothers pinned all the blame on Humberto Castro as the triggerman and sole perpetrator. Both brothers only spent 11 months detained and were acquitted. Meanwhile, Castro was sentenced to 43 years in prison, but in 2001 his sentence was reduced to 26 years, and in 2005, after serving only 11 years in prison, he was released under good conduct. And where has this left us? What have we learned? Apparently nothing. Sure, no other player has been killed because of a mistake they made after a game, at least that I'm aware of, but the behavior of some people surrounding football has not changed. I won't go too in depth because it's something that I plan to talk about again in a future video, but in the modern era of football, social media has given us a platform to attack and harass players while being safe behind a screen, forgetting that they are humans too, who make mistakes and have feelings and families that can be hurt from watching these comments. Criticism is fine. After all, these people are getting paid to do a job, and getting paid a lot for that matter. And if you're not good at your job, someone should point that out for you. But the sheer scale of the abuse that I've seen sometimes is just borderline inhumane. We are not aware of the damage we could be causing to these people and where it could leave them. So before you go on Twitter to rant about how your team lost this weekend, be careful with the words you use. After all, this is just a game, and life must not end here.